The sound of distant machinery hummed faintly in the background of Elon Musk's state-of-the-art office, nestled atop a Los Angeles skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's sprawling landscape, though Elon hardly noticed it. He was seated at a sleek, steel-gray desk, his focus split between the endless emails on his laptop screen and the noise of his thoughts. Even amidst his billion-dollar innovations, there was something about this day that felt unusually draining. Richard Kavanaugh, his longtime legal advisor and confidant, entered the room with an urgency that was rare for him. In one hand, he carried a leather folder, its contents neatly tucked but exuding an air of peculiarity. Richard's tailored suit was immaculate, as always, but there was an uncharacteristic hesitation in his movements. "Elon," Richard began, closing the glass door behind him. "I need to discuss something unique. It's not the usual kind of proposal, but it has the potential to solve one of your current challenges in a way you may not expect." Without looking up, Elon responded in his usual clipped tone. "Unless it involves faster battery technology or shaving 6 months off the Mars mission timeline, it can wait." Richard sighed, walking to the desk and placing the folder down with deliberate care. "I think you'll want to hear this. It ties directly into the new sustainable factory project in Nevada." At the mention of the factory, Elon finally looked up, his steely blue eyes narrowing as they shifted to Richard. "I'm listening." Richard didn't waste time. He flipped open the folder to reveal several documents, each with legal jargon and clauses meticulously outlined. But what caught Elon's attention wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the bold headline at the top: "Temporary Marital Contract Agreement." A furrow appeared between Elon's brows. Marriage. His voice was tinged with disbelief as he leaned back in his chair. "Richard, please tell me this is some kind of joke." "I assure you, it's not," Richard said, his tone measured. "It's unconventional, yes. But hear me out before dismissing it." Elon crossed his arms, his expression skeptical but curious enough to indulge him. "Go on." Richard adjusted his glasses, choosing his words carefully. "The woman in question is Samantha Greer. She inherited an animal shelter from her late father, a modest operation, but one that's become her life's work. Unfortunately, she's on the verge of losing it. Financial troubles, property disputes, and mounting debts have left her with few options." Elon raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly does this involve me?" "The land where her shelter sits is critical for the factory's expansion. Securing it would streamline the construction process and unlock significant tax incentives. However, she's adamant about not selling. She's determined to preserve the shelter, no matter the cost." Elon's tone sharpened. "And your solution is what?" "I marry her and magically make this problem go away." "Essentially, yes," Richard admitted, undeterred by Elon's sarcasm. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. You provide her with the financial stability she needs to save the shelter. In return, the marriage unlocks the incentives tied to the land use agreement. It's temporary, strictly business." Elon tapped his fingers on the desk, his expression unreadable. "And why would she agree to this?" "She's desperate to save those animals, Elon. From what I've gathered, she'd do just about anything to keep the shelter running. This deal would guarantee its future. She's willing to accept the terms, including signing a non-disclosure agreement to protect your privacy." Richard hesitated before adding, "But I should mention, she's not the type of woman you're accustomed to being associated with. She's kind, compassionate, but she's also overweight. And the media will undoubtedly weaponize that." Elon let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I can already see the headlines. Tech genius marries out of charity. Or better yet, Elon Musk's bizarre marriage for profit. This could be a PR disaster, Richard." "Which is why we'd handle it discreetly," Richard countered. "A private ceremony, no leaks, no media circus. It's clean, efficient, and solves multiple problems at once." Elon rose from his chair and walked toward the window, his hands in his pockets. The city glittered below him, a testament to human ingenuity and to the kind of noise he preferred to avoid. What's the alternative? Without this arrangement, the land deal gets tied up in court. You could still move forward, but at a much higher cost and significant delays. The weight of the proposal settled between them, the silence stretching longer than usual. Elon's mind worked through the implications, calculating the risks and rewards as if it were just another engineering problem. But there was something about this that felt distinctly human. Messy. Complicated. After what felt like an eternity, Elon finally turned. His expression was as controlled as ever, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or resignation. "Fine," he said. "I'll agree to meet her. But let's get one thing straight. This is a business arrangement. No emotions, no complications. Just a means to an end." Richard nodded, relieved but cautious. "Understood. I'll set it up." As Richard gathered the folder and left the room, Elon remained by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For all his confidence, there was an unshakable sense of unease brewing inside him. This wasn't a problem he could solve with equations or rocket science. It was something far more unpredictable. And Elon Musk hated unpredictability. The coffee shop Richard had chosen for the meeting was deliberately unassuming, a quiet corner spot in Pasadena, far from the prying eyes of paparazzi or overzealous fans. Elon arrived first, punctual as always, his every movement precise and deliberate. He sat at a table near the back, the industrial decor and soft hum of conversation serving as a neutral backdrop. His espresso sat untouched as he stared at the entrance, his expression unreadable. He wasn't sure what he expected when Samantha Greer walked in, but it wasn't the woman who nervously stepped through the door. She was dressed in a simple floral dress paired with a denim jacket, her curly auburn hair framing a face that was warm but visibly tense. She clutched her purse tightly, scanning the room until her eyes landed on him. For a moment, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders and made her way over. "Mr. Musk?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Elon," he corrected, standing to greet her. He extended a hand, which she shook briefly before sitting across from him. "You must be Samantha." "Yes," she replied, managing a small smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Her hands fidgeted in her lap, betraying her nervousness, but her eyes held a quiet determination. Elon studied her with the same intensity he reserved for problem-solving, noting every detail: the faint smudge of dirt on her jacket sleeve, likely from the shelter, the way her gaze flicked to the door as if weighing an escape route, the slight flush on her cheeks. "I'm told you're passionate about your work," he began, cutting straight to the point. "The shelter means a great deal to you." "It's everything to me," Samantha admitted, her voice firm despite her nerves. "My father started it from nothing, and after he passed, I couldn't let it go. Those animals have nowhere else to go. Without the shelter, without this agreement," she trailed off, her expression tightening. Elon nodded, leaning back in his chair. "And you're willing to marry a complete stranger to keep it running?" Her eyes met his, unexpectedly fierce. "I am. But I have one condition." That caught him off guard. "A condition?" "Yes." Samantha straightened in her chair, her voice gaining strength. "If we do this, you'll spend at least part of the year actually helping at the shelter. Not just writing checks or taking photos for publicity. I need you to understand what you're helping to save." For a moment, Elon simply stared at her. Few people had the nerve to make demands of him, and fewer still while sitting across the table from him. Yet here she was, a woman who by all accounts should have been intimidated, holding her ground with quiet conviction. "I don't think you understand how busy I am," he replied, his tone cool but not unkind. "I have companies to run. A marriage of convenience is one thing, but I can't afford distractions." "Then you'll need to make time," Samantha countered. "I won't agree to this otherwise." Elon tilted his head, a flicker of something like amusement crossing his features. "You're surprisingly bold for someone who needs my help." "I'm bold because the animals need my help," she shot back. "And if this marriage is going to happen, I want to know you're at least a little invested in what it's for." He leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Do you realize what you're asking of me? This isn't how I operate." "Maybe not," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "But this isn't just about you. The silence between them stretched, tense and electric. Finally, Elon exhaled sharply, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fine, I'll agree to your condition, but don't expect me to spend more than the bare minimum of time there. That's more than enough," Samantha said, her relief evident, though she didn't dare show too much gratitude. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the arrangement settling over them. Samantha shifted in her seat, breaking the quiet. "For what it's worth, I don't want this to be awkward or difficult. I know this is just business, but I appreciate what you're doing." Elon's expression softened ever so slightly. "Let's not make this more sentimental than it needs to be. We both know why we're here." "Of course," she replied, her tone neutral. The conversation wound down quickly after that, with Richard stepping in to finalize logistics once Samantha had left. As Elon watched her walk away, a small part of him couldn't shake the impression she'd left. There was something unshakably genuine about her, a quality he wasn't used to encountering in his meticulously controlled world. For better or worse, this wasn't going to be as straightforward as he had hoped. The ceremony was held in the garden of a private estate just outside San Diego, far removed from the bustle of the city and any prying eyes. Elon Musk had insisted on a minimalist affair. No reporters, no overblown decorations, no unnecessary spectacle. For him, this was a transaction, and every aspect of the day reflected that. Samantha arrived in a modest ivory dress, her auburn curls pinned loosely back. She looked composed but hesitant, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies. The dress, chosen for its simplicity, skimmed her frame, doing little to hide her full figure, a fact she was acutely aware of as she caught her reflection in a passing mirror. Her heart pounded with a mix of nerves and resignation. Elon stood at the altar, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that seemed more appropriate for a boardroom than a wedding. His expression was as controlled as ever, betraying no emotion as he waited. Beside him stood Richard, whose calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the quiet tension hanging in the air. Samantha's footsteps on the stone path echoed softly as she made her way toward him, escorted not by family, but by the silence of the empty garden. The officiant, a neutral-faced notary hired specifically for the occasion, gave her a polite nod as she reached the altar. Elon extended a hand to help her step onto the platform. His touch was brief, almost perfunctory, and they exchanged the smallest of glances before turning to face the officiant. The ceremony itself was painfully brisk. The notary read through the required legal declarations, his monotone voice blending with the rustling leaves. "Do you, Elon Musk, take Samantha Greer to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as this agreement shall remain in effect?" Elon's reply came immediately, his voice firm and detached. "I do." "And do you, Samantha Greer, take Elon Musk to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as this agreement shall remain in effect?" Samantha hesitated for the briefest moment, her gaze flickering to Elon's face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoicism. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I do." The rings were exchanged, a simple band for her, a sleek titanium one for him. Neither of them spoke beyond what was required, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, there was no applause, no smiles, no celebratory fanfare. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant said, though his tone suggested even he knew this was a mere formality. Elon hesitated, then leaned in and placed a quick, mechanical kiss on Samantha's cheek. It was over before she could fully process it. "Congratulations," the officiant said flatly, closing his folder and stepping away. Samantha glanced down at the ring now on her finger, a simple piece of jewelry that felt like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Elon, ever pragmatic, turned to Richard. "Is the paperwork finalized?" "Already taken care of," Richard replied, his professionalism unwavering. Samantha's heart sank slightly at the cold efficiency of it all, but she had expected nothing less. Still, a faint pang of humiliation settled in her chest. This was her wedding day, and yet it felt more like signing a business contract than entering a partnership. As the ceremony concluded, a private photographer hired by Richard took a handful of discreet shots for legal documentation. Samantha was grateful they weren't intended for public consumption, though that relief was short-lived. By the next morning, several leaked photos of the wedding began circulating online. The headlines were brutal. Elon Musk marries in secret ceremony. Meet his mysterious wife, who is Samantha Greer. Internet reacts to Elon Musk's surprising marriage, business move, or true love. Billionaire ties the knot with animal shelter owner. The accompanying commentary was even worse. Social media exploded with cruel jokes about Samantha's appearance, speculation about her motives, and conspiracy theories about why Elon had married her in the first place. Samantha avoided her phone, but the whispers reached her regardless. Even at the shelter, volunteers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to say. She kept her head down, pouring herself into her work with even more intensity, but the sting of public ridicule lingered. For Elon, the headlines were a nuisance he brushed aside with practiced ease. Yet, as he scrolled through the articles during a rare moment of downtime, something gnawed at him. The harsh words about Samantha were harsher than he'd anticipated, and despite his usual detachment, an unfamiliar feeling crept in: guilt. That evening, he returned to their shared home, a sprawling estate he had barely set foot in since the wedding. Samantha was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a pile of donation receipts for the shelter. Her face was drawn, and though she didn't look up when he entered, her body tensed. "They're relentless, aren't they?" she said softly, breaking the silence. "Ignore them," Elon replied, his voice clipped. "They'll move on to something else soon enough." "That's easy for you to say," she muttered, her tone sharper than she intended. "You're not the one they're tearing apart." Elon stiffened, but didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he said, "People will always find something to criticize. Let them talk." Samantha set the receipts aside and finally looked up at him. "Is that what you do? Pretend it doesn't bother you?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb his words. "Well, I'm not you, Elon, and maybe I don't want to be." He didn't reply, instead turning and leaving the room. For the first time in years, Elon felt the weight of someone else's disappointment, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The sprawling estate where Elon and Samantha now lived was nothing short of breathtaking. Nestled in the hills outside Los Angeles, it boasted pristine white walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and acres of meticulously maintained gardens. Inside, the design was minimalist, almost clinical, exactly what Elon preferred. But to Samantha, it felt sterile, like living in a museum where she wasn't allowed to touch anything. Their days quickly fell into an unspoken routine. Elon left early, disappearing into meetings, factory visits, or his endless stream of projects. Samantha spent her mornings at the shelter, often working late into the evening. When they crossed paths in the house, their interactions were polite but distant, like co-workers who barely knew each other. One evening, Samantha returned home later than usual, her hands covered in scratches from a particularly uncooperative stray dog she'd been rescuing. As she entered the vast kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee caught her off guard. Elon was there, sitting at the marble island, his laptop glowing faintly in front of him. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his screen. "Long day." "Always," she replied, heading to the sink to wash her hands. She winced as the soap stung her cuts. "What happened to your hands?" Elon asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes briefly flicking toward the injuries. "Just another rescue," she said with a shrug. "A scared terrier got tangled in some wire. Took a while to get him out." Elon nodded, but his gaze lingered a moment longer before he returned to typing. The silence between them stretched, heavy and awkward. "You know," Samantha said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "it wouldn't kill you to visit the shelter once in a while." Elon paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I've been busy." "You're always busy," she shot back, turning to face him. That doesn't mean you can't spare a few hours to see what you're supposedly supporting. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with that calculating look she was beginning to recognize. What exactly would you like me to do there? Pick up after the dogs? Build new kennels? Maybe start by just showing up, she said, crossing her arms. The volunteers would love to meet you, and the animals could use a little attention from someone who's supposedly their benefactor. Elon's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smirk. You're surprisingly persistent, and you're surprisingly detached, she retorted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elon closed his laptop with a decisive click. Fine, I'll come by tomorrow. Briefly. Don't do me any favors, Samantha muttered, though she couldn't hide the flicker of satisfaction in her expression. The next day, Elon arrived at the shelter in one of his Teslas, its sleek design looking wildly out of place in the dusty gravel lot. Samantha was in the middle of cleaning a kennel when she spotted him stepping out of the car, dressed in a crisp white shirt and tailored slacks that screamed impracticality for the environment. You might want to roll up your sleeves, she said as he approached. Things tend to get messy around here. Elon glanced around, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild distaste. The shelter was modest, its chain-link fences and weathered buildings a stark contrast to the polished spaces he was used to. Where do you need me? He asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't his natural habitat. Samantha handed him a pair of gloves. Start with the outdoor pens. Some of the dogs haven't been walked yet. For the next hour, Elon found himself being pulled along by an energetic lab mix, dodging mud puddles and barking dogs. Samantha watched from a distance, a small smile tugging at her lips as he awkwardly tried to control the leash. You're doing great, she called out teasingly when the lab nearly dragged him into a pile of leaves. Elon shot her a withering look, but didn't complain. By the end of the visit, his shirt was wrinkled, his shoes were covered in dirt, and his patience was clearly fraying. Yet, as he watched Samantha crouch down to comfort a nervous collie, something shifted. Her voice was soft, her touch gentle, and the dog slowly leaned into her hand as if sensing her sincerity. For the first time, Elon felt a twinge of admiration for her work. It wasn't just that she cared, it was the way she poured every ounce of herself into it, even when no one was watching. When they returned to the car, Samantha turned to him. Thanks for coming. I know this isn't exactly your scene. Elon shrugged. It was educational. That's a polite way of saying you hated it, she said with a laugh. He almost smiled. Not entirely. As they drove back to the estate, the silence between them felt different. Less heavy, more companionable. Neither of them said it, but a small crack had formed in the wall between them. And though Elon didn't know it yet, that crack would only grow wider in the days to come. The charity gala for Samantha's shelter was held in the modest banquet hall of a downtown hotel. Samantha had insisted on keeping the event low-key, pouring most of the budget into the shelter instead of extravagant decorations or catering. Still, the room was warm and inviting, adorned with string lights and handmade banners featuring photos of rescued animals. Samantha stood at the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Dressed in an elegant emerald green gown that complemented her auburn hair, she looked radiant, though there was a nervous energy in her movements. This event was crucial, not just for the shelter's funding, but for proving to herself that she could manage something of this scale. Elon arrived later than planned, slipping into the room with the precision of someone used to avoiding attention. He scanned the crowd and quickly spotted Samantha near the stage, her hands clasped as she spoke to a small group of donors. "Cutting it close, aren't you?" she said when he approached, her tone light but tinged with a hint of reproach. "Traffic," Elon replied succinctly, his expression neutral. Samantha arched an eyebrow but let it slide. "I'm just glad you came. It means a lot to the volunteers, and to me." He gave her a small nod, but his eyes wandered to the room, taking in the crowd. The event was clearly well organized, despite its modest budget. A slideshow of the shelter's success stories played on a projector, and several rescued animals mingled with guests, charming them into opening their wallets. "Let me guess," Elon said, his voice low. You're hoping my presence will inspire bigger donations." Samantha didn't deny it. "You're not exactly subtle, Elon. People notice when you're around, and if it helps the shelter, I'll take it." Before he could respond, a volunteer waved her over, and she excused herself. Elon watched as she moved through the room, her smile warm and genuine as she spoke with donors. There was something disarming about her presence, he realized, an authenticity that made people want to help. As the evening progressed, Samantha took the stage to give her speech. The room quieted as she stepped up to the microphone, glancing nervously at the small stack of notes in her hand. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady but soft. "When my father started the shelter, it wasn't much more than a rundown barn and a dream. He believed that every animal deserved a second chance, no matter how broken or scared they were. After he passed, I promised I'd keep that dream alive." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This shelter isn't just a place for animals. It's a community. It's hope. And tonight, you're all part of that hope. Your support means more than I can ever put into words." As she spoke, Elon found himself leaning forward, his attention fully captured. There was a fire in her words, a raw passion that made even the most skeptical listener believe in her cause. She wasn't just pleading for help. She was inspiring people to care as deeply as she did. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, and Elon caught himself clapping before he even realized it. Later, as the crowd mingled, Elon found himself cornered by an elderly donor who seemed more interested in his fame than the shelter. "So, Mr. Musk," the man said, swirling his glass of champagne, "I must admit, I was surprised to hear about your involvement with this little operation. Not exactly your usual arena, is it?" Elon's jaw tightened. "I believe in supporting causes that matter," he said curtly. The man chuckled, clearly not taking the answer seriously. "Well, your wife certainly has a knack for rallying people. She's got a charm about her, doesn't she? Though I suppose it's the animals people are really here for." Before Elon could respond, Samantha appeared at his side, sensing the tension. "Mr. Albright," she said warmly, extending a hand. "Thank you so much for coming. I saw your generous pledge earlier. It means the world to us." The man visibly softened, his attention shifting to Samantha's earnest gratitude. "Anything for the animals, my dear," he said before excusing himself. As he walked away, Samantha turned to Elon, her smile fading. "You don't have to defend me, you know. I can handle people like him." "I wasn't defending you," Elon said, though the edge in his voice suggested otherwise. She gave him a knowing look, but let it drop. "Well, thanks anyway, and for being here. It really does make a difference." As the gala wound down, Elon stayed longer than he'd planned, watching as Samantha personally thanked every guest. Her energy never wavered, even as the room emptied and exhaustion set in. When the last donor had left, she collapsed into a chair, kicking off her heels with a relieved sigh. "I think that went well," she said, glancing at Elon, who had been quietly observing from across the room. "You impressed them," he admitted, his tone almost grudging. "You're good at this." "Passion helps," she replied with a small smile. "And stubbornness." Elon walked over, his hands in his pockets. "You know, not many people can command a room like that. It's not just the animals. They believe in you." Samantha blinked, caught off guard by the rare compliment. "Thanks. That means a lot coming from you." For a moment, the air between them felt lighter, almost comfortable. But before it could settle, Samantha's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face fell. "What is it?" Elon asked. "One of the dogs at the shelter, Buddy. He's not doing well. I need to check on him." Without hesitation, Elon said, "I'll drive you." Samantha looked at him in surprise, but she didn't argue. As they left the empty banquet hall and headed toward the shelter, a strange sense of camaraderie hung between them. For the first time, it felt like they were moving toward the same goal, even if they didn't fully understand each other yet. The drive to the shelter was quiet, save for the faint hum of the Tesla's engine. Elon focused on the road while Samantha stared out the window, her thoughts swirling around Buddy, the sick dog awaiting her attention. The events of the gala still lingered in her mind, especially Elon's unexpected offer to help. She glanced at him briefly, trying to read his inscrutable expression, but as always, he was impossible to decipher. When they arrived, the shelter was dark except for a single light in the main office. Samantha quickly led Elon inside, her pace brisk as she explained Buddy's condition. "He's an older shepherd mix," she said, unlocking the kennel area. "Heart issues. The vet warned me his time might be short, but I was hoping he'd hold on longer." Elon followed her through the rows of kennels, the faint sounds of restless animals filling the air. When they reached Buddy, the dog was lying on a blanket, his breathing shallow. Samantha knelt beside him, her face softening as she stroked his head. "Hey, Buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You're okay? I'm here." Elon stood back, observing the scene. He wasn't a dog person, not really, but something about the way Samantha cared for the animal stirred a faint sense of discomfort. Not because he was bothered by her emotions, but because they were so foreign to him. "Is there anything that can be done?" he asked quietly. Samantha shook her head. "Not really. Just keeping him comfortable until..." She trailed off, her eyes glistening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elon stepped closer, crouching beside her. "Why do you do this?" "What do you mean?" "All of it," he said, gesturing around the room. "You pour everything into this shelter. Your time, your money, your energy. Even when it's..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Hopeless." Samantha looked at him, surprised by the question. "Because it's not hopeless. Not to them." She gestured toward Buddy, who let out a soft whine as she patted his side. "I know I can't save them all, but for the ones I can save, it matters. Even if it's just making sure their last days are peaceful." Elon's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of something unfamiliar crossing his face. Before he could respond, Buddy stirred, drawing Samantha's attention back to the dog. The next day, Elon returned to his office, his mind still lingering on the events at the shelter. He was halfway through a meeting when Richard walked in unannounced, a rare breach of protocol that immediately put Elon on edge. "This better be important," Elon said curtly, dismissing the rest of his team with a quick wave. "It is," Richard replied, his tone serious. He placed a thick folder on Elon's desk, the edges of his movements sharp with purpose. "What is it now?" Elon asked, leaning back in his chair. Richard adjusted his glasses. "An offer. A highly lucrative one." Elon raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. "It's from an international energy conglomerate," Richard explained. "They're offering a substantial investment, far more than what we originally secured through the shelter agreement. But there's a catch." "Of course there is," Elon said dryly. "What is it?" "They want exclusivity, which means the Nevada project would need to shift focus. And," Richard hesitated, "it would require dissolving your current arrangement with Samantha." Elon's expression darkened. "You're suggesting I end the marriage early?" Richard nodded. "Yes. The shelter would still receive funding. It's part of their proposal. But the marriage contract would no longer be necessary." For a long moment, Elon said nothing. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his desk, his mind racing. The offer made sense on paper. More money, fewer complications, and an easier path forward for the factory. Yet, the idea of walking away from the agreement left an unexpected weight in his chest. "What's the timeline?" Elon finally asked. "They want an answer within the week," Richard said. "It's a generous deal, Elon. One I don't think we should pass up." Elon stared at the folder, his jaw tightening. "I'll think about it." That evening, Samantha was at the shelter when Elon arrived unannounced. She was in the middle of stacking crates of donated food when he walked in, his presence immediately filling the small space. "You're here late," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I needed to talk to you," Elon replied, his voice unusually subdued. Samantha set down the crate, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "I received an offer today. A business proposal. One that could benefit the factory significantly." "Okay," Samantha said slowly, unsure of where this was going. Elon met her gaze, his expression unreadable. It would require ending the marriage early. Samantha froze, her stomach tightening. I see. They've agreed to fund the shelter regardless, he added quickly, as if trying to soften the blow. You wouldn't lose anything. In fact, you'd probably gain more stability in the long run. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Of course. Stability. Samantha, this was always meant to be temporary, Elon said, his tone carefully controlled. You knew that. I did, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. But that doesn't make it any easier to hear. The room fell into a tense silence. Elon shifted uncomfortably, his mind wrestling with the decision. For the first time, he found himself questioning whether the logical choice was the right one. I haven't decided yet, he admitted finally. Samantha looked at him, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. Do what you need to do, Elon. Just don't pretend this is about me. It never was. Her words hit harder than he expected, leaving him standing there as she walked away, her shoulders squared, but her steps heavy. As he drove home that night, Elon couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that, for all his accomplishments, he was about to make a mistake he couldn't undo. Rain hammered down on the roof of the animal shelter, each drop a sharp reminder of the storm's intensity. Samantha stood in the dim light of the shelter's main office, staring out the window as water pooled in the gravel parking lot. She clenched her phone tightly, her voice tinged with panic as she spoke. The back kennels are flooding, she said, pacing. If we don't move the animals now, we'll lose them. On the other end of the line, one of the volunteers promised to arrive as soon as the roads were safe. But Samantha knew it might be too late. The storm was worsening, and the shelter's drainage system, already strained by years of neglect, was no match for the relentless downpour. Samantha hung up and grabbed a flashlight, determination flaring in her chest despite the overwhelming odds. She refused to let the animals suffer. Just as she opened the door to the torrential rain, headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek black Tesla pulled into the lot, its tires splashing through the rising water. Samantha blinked, momentarily stunned, as Elon stepped out, his usually immaculate appearance already damp from the storm. You shouldn't be here, she called out over the noise of the rain. It's dangerous. Neither should you, Elon shot back, striding toward her. He carried a raincoat in one hand and a determined expression on his face. What's the situation? The back kennels are flooding, Samantha said, her voice cracking. We need to move the animals to higher ground, but it's just me right now. The volunteers are stuck on the other side of town. Without hesitation, Elon pulled on the raincoat. Then let's get to work. The next hour was chaos. Together, Samantha and Elon trudged through the muddy paths between the kennels, opening gates and coaxing terrified dogs out of their enclosures. The rain drenched them both, the cold biting at their skin as they worked side by side. Samantha struggled with a large pit bull, the dog's panic making it nearly impossible to secure the leash. Elon stepped in, his firm grip steadying the dog while Samantha attached the lead. Got it, he asked, his voice strained but calm. She nodded, wiping rain from her face. Thanks. They moved the animals to a storage room that had been hastily converted into a temporary shelter. Samantha lined the floor with blankets while Elon carried in crates, his usual efficiency now focused on the task at hand. When the last dog was safe, Samantha collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Elon sank down beside her, his rain-soaked hair plastered to his forehead. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of the storm raging outside filling the silence. Then Samantha turned to him, her voice soft. Why did you come? Elon didn't look at her immediately, his gaze fixed on the puddle forming beneath his boots. Richard told me about the storm, he said finally. I figured you need help. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You helping at the shelter during a storm? That's not exactly on brand for you, Elon. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe not, but it felt important. Samantha searched his face, looking for the cool detachment she'd grown accustomed to, but instead she found something else, something softer, almost uncertain. "Well," she said after a moment, "I'm glad you're here. I couldn't have done this alone." Elon nodded, his eyes drifting to the dogs huddled together in the makeshift shelter. "They're lucky to have you." Samantha's breath hitched slightly at the unexpected compliment, but she quickly pushed the emotion aside. "We're not out of the woods yet. If the rain keeps up, the main building could flood too. Then we'll deal with it," Elon said simply. The certainty in his voice gave her a flicker of hope, and for the first time that night, she felt like they might actually make it through. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the shelter battered but intact. The volunteers finally arrived, helping to clean up the damage and return the animals to their kennels. Samantha and Elon worked alongside them, though exhaustion was etched into their faces. When the last task was finished, Samantha slumped onto a bench outside, the early sunlight warming her skin. Elon joined her, handing her a bottle of water. "You're relentless," he said, his tone tinged with admiration. "So are you," she replied, cracking a tired smile. He glanced at her, his usual guarded expression softening. "I see why this place means so much to you. It's not just a shelter. It's everything." Samantha nodded, her gaze distant. "It is. It's my dad's legacy, and it's the only place I've ever felt like I'm doing something that matters." "You are," Elon said quietly. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, they sat in companionable silence. When Elon finally stood to leave, he hesitated. "If you need anything, resources, repairs, just let me know. I'll take care of it." Samantha looked up at him, her heart tightening. "Thank you, Elon." As he walked to his car, she watched him go, wondering if the man she'd written off as cold and self-serving might be capable of more than she'd given him credit for. For Elon, the drive home was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. The image of Samantha, drenched and determined, stayed with him, and for the first time, he questioned whether this arrangement was about more than business after all. The storm's aftermath lingered in the air. The shelter had survived, but the strain on Samantha was evident. Days of non-stop repairs, meetings with donors, and caring for the animals left her visibly exhausted. Elon, though he'd returned to his usual whirlwind of projects, found himself preoccupied by thoughts of her. One afternoon, he decided to stop by the shelter unannounced. As he stepped inside, the familiar cacophony of barking dogs greeted him, but Samantha was nowhere in sight. A volunteer named Carla approached him, looking harried. "Mr. Musk," she said, clearly surprised. "Samantha's not here right now. She had to leave early. Doctor's appointment." Elon frowned. "Doctor's appointment? Is she all right?" Carla hesitated, glancing away. "I'm not sure. She hasn't really talked about it." The response didn't sit well with Elon. Samantha had mentioned nothing about health issues, but something about her recent behavior, her fatigue, her occasional moments of distraction, suddenly made sense. That evening, back at the estate, Elon waited for Samantha to return. She arrived just after sunset, carrying a folder and looking unusually pale. She froze when she saw him in the living room, his expression one of quiet intensity. "Hey," she said cautiously, setting down her bag. "What's going on?" Elon didn't waste time. "Carla mentioned you had a doctor's appointment today. Is there something you need to tell me?" Samantha's eyes widened slightly, and she immediately looked away, her hands tightening around the folder she held. "It's nothing, just a routine checkup." "I don't believe you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've been pushing yourself too hard, and now you're hiding something. What is it?" Samantha sighed, her shoulders slumping as she sank into the nearest chair. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if weighing whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening. "I didn't want to bring this into the agreement," she began softly. "You've already done so much for the shelter, and this wasn't supposed to be your problem." "What wasn't supposed to be my problem?" Elon pressed, stepping closer. She took a shaky breath. "A few months before we got married, I was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. It's not dire, not yet, but it's serious. The doctors are monitoring it, and I'm on medication, but she trailed off, her voice breaking. Elon stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily in the room. Why didn't you tell me? Because this marriage was supposed to be a business arrangement, she said bitterly. I wasn't going to burden you with something that has nothing to do with you. Besides, she added with a hollow laugh, you wouldn't have agreed to this if you'd known, would you? Her words stung, and Elon struggled to find a response. She wasn't entirely wrong. At the time, he might have seen her condition as a liability. But now, the thought of her facing this alone filled him with a deep, unfamiliar discomfort. You should have told me, he said finally, his voice softer now. Samantha shook her head. Why? So you could pity me? So you could feel obligated to help me? She stood abruptly, pacing the room. I didn't want that. All I wanted was to save the shelter. That's why I agreed to this ridiculous arrangement in the first place. And if this, she gestured between them, falls apart tomorrow, at least I'll know I did everything I could for those animals. Elon watched her silently, his mind racing. For the first time, he saw the full depth of her sacrifice, not just for the shelter, but for the life she'd chosen to lead despite her diagnosis. Is that why you've been pushing yourself so hard? He asked quietly. Yes, she admitted, because I don't know how much time I have. And if that time runs out, I want to know I made a difference. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging between them. Elon's typical instinct to solve problems, to fix things, felt inadequate here. This wasn't an issue of engineering or logistics. This was life, raw and unpredictable. Finally, he spoke. You're not alone in this, Samantha. Whether you like it or not, I'm part of this now. And I'm not going to stand by while you run yourself into the ground. She looked at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. Why do you even care? Elon hesitated, his usual wall of detachment cracking just slightly. Because you matter. More than I expected you to. Samantha's breath caught, but she quickly looked away, her defenses still firmly in place. I don't need your charity, Elon. I can handle this. It's not charity, he said firmly. It's something else. For the first time in years, Elon Musk found himself at a loss for words. But he knew one thing for certain. Samantha Greer was no longer just part of a contract. She was someone who mattered to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The estate was unusually quiet that night, the silence punctuated only by the faint rustle of wind outside. Elon sat in his home office, a dim desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He stared at the stack of papers in front of him, Richard's lucrative proposal to end the marriage early. The figures on the page were compelling, the kind of deal any rational person would take without a second thought. But Elon couldn't focus on the numbers. His mind kept drifting back to Samantha, her confession, the raw emotion in her voice, the way her shoulders had trembled as she revealed her secret. He rubbed his temples, frustrated by the unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. For a man who prided himself on logic and precision, the feelings stirred by Samantha were disconcerting. She had been a means to an end, a carefully calculated step in a larger plan. And yet, somewhere along the way, she had become more than that. Elon's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw Richard's name. Did you read the proposal? Richard asked as soon as Elon answered. I did. And Elon hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. It's a good deal. Good. Richard sounded incredulous. Elon, this is a no-brainer. We're talking about streamlining your factory expansion, securing long-term partnerships, and avoiding the PR headache of this arrangement. It's the logical move. Elon leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. It's not that simple. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You're hesitating, Richard said, his voice quieter now. Why? Elon exhaled sharply. Because Samantha isn't just part of the deal anymore. Richard was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone was careful. Elon, you entered this agreement with a clear purpose. If you're starting to second-guess yourself because of personal feelings, I'm not second-guessing, Elon interrupted, though even he wasn't sure if that was true. Then make the call, Richard pressed. Before you let this complicate things further. Elon hung up, without responding, the weight of the decision still unresolved. The next morning, he decided to clear his head the only way he knew how, by immersing himself in Samantha's world. He arrived at the shelter unannounced, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket. Samantha was in the outdoor pen, supervising volunteers as they played with a group of energetic dogs. She glanced up when she saw him, her expression a mix of surprise and guarded curiosity. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I had some free time," Elon replied casually, though his presence was anything but casual. "Free time," she repeated with a wry smile. "That's a first." He didn't respond, instead watching as a young golden retriever bounded toward her, tail wagging furiously. Samantha knelt to greet the dog, her face lighting up as she scratched its ears. "You're good at this," Elon said after a moment. She glanced at him, a flicker of skepticism in her eyes. "Good at what?" "Connecting with them," he said simply. Samantha stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "It's not hard. They just want to be loved. No judgment, no expectations, just love." Her words hung in the air, and Elon felt a pang of discomfort. She wasn't just talking about the animals. Later, as they walked through the shelter together, Elon noticed a faded photograph hanging on the office wall. It showed a younger Samantha with her father, standing in front of the shelter's original building. She looked happy, carefree in a way he hadn't seen since they'd met. "That was the day we opened," Samantha said quietly, following his gaze. "I was 18, and my dad had just sunk every penny he had into this place. Everyone thought he was crazy, but he never cared what people thought." Elon studied her face, the nostalgia and pain mingling in her expression. "You're a lot like him," he said. Samantha let out a soft laugh. "I hope so. He was the bravest person I've ever known." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of her father's legacy filling the room. Then Samantha turned to him, her expression serious. "Why are you really here, Elon?" she asked. He hesitated, the carefully constructed walls he always kept around himself beginning to crumble. "Because I don't know how to walk away from this." "From you?" Samantha blinked, clearly startled by his honesty. "You're the one with a choice, remember? I never asked you to stay." "I know," he said, his voice quieter now, "but staying feels like the only choice that matters." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, a volunteer called her name, pulling her attention away. As she walked off, Elon remained where he was, staring at the photograph again. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain, not about what he wanted, but about whether he was brave enough to pursue it. The boardroom at Tesla's headquarters hummed with quiet tension as Elon Musk addressed his executive team. The group was accustomed to his bold ideas and unorthodox approaches, but the announcement he was about to make felt different, more personal. "I'm stepping away from the deal with Arco Energy," Elon stated, his voice calm but resolute. A murmur swept through the room. One of the executives, a man named Patel, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Elon, this could cost us millions in immediate capital and delay the Nevada project by months. Are you sure this is the right move?" "It's the only move," Elon replied firmly. "Integrity matters, and we're not sacrificing that for short-term gains." Richard, seated at the far end of the table, looked visibly irritated but didn't argue. He'd already seen the determination in Elon's eyes and knew it would be a losing battle. Elon continued, his gaze steady. "We'll pivot our strategy, absorb the costs, and move forward without compromising the commitments we've already made." The team exchanged hesitant glances but ultimately nodded in agreement. Elon's reputation for turning challenges into opportunities gave them confidence, even if they didn't fully understand his motivations. Later that day, Elon arrived at the shelter unannounced once again. This time, he came with a plan. Samantha was in the office, reviewing adoption applications, when he walked in. She looked up, surprised but not entirely pleased. "You're becoming a regular around here," she said, her tone light but guarded. "I had something I needed to do," Elon replied, placing a folder on the desk in front of her. Samantha hesitated before opening it, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Elon, what is this?" "It's a grant," he explained. "A permanent endowment to expand the shelter and establish a foundation in your name. You'll have the resources to keep this place running indefinitely, and more importantly, to scale your work." Samantha blinked, overwhelmed. I don't even know what to say. This is incredible. But why are you doing this?" Elon met her gaze, his voice softer now. "Because you've built something that matters. And because it's the right thing to do." She shook her head, still trying to process the magnitude of the gift. "Elon, this is too much. I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "This doesn't fix everything, you know," she said, her voice cracking. "It doesn't make what we've been through any less complicated." "I know," Elon replied, his expression serious. "But it's a start." The following week, Elon held a press conference to announce the new foundation. Standing in front of a room full of journalists and cameras, he spoke about the importance of compassion and responsibility, not just in business, but in life. The Samantha Greer Foundation will focus on animal welfare, education, and sustainability, Elon said, his voice steady. "This partnership is about creating lasting change, not just for the animals Samantha has dedicated her life to, but for the communities they inspire." Samantha, seated in the front row, watched in stunned silence. She hadn't expected him to put her name at the forefront, and the gesture left her both humbled and conflicted. When the event ended, she approached him quietly. "That was unexpected," she said, her tone cautious. Elon smiled faintly. "You deserve the credit, Samantha. You've done more with less than most people could dream of." She hesitated, studying his face. "I still don't understand you, Elon. One minute you're detached and calculating, and the next you're doing something like this. Why?" He looked at her, his usual confidence giving way to a rare vulnerability. "Because I want to be better than I was. And because you showed me how." Samantha's breath caught, but she didn't respond immediately. The weight of his words and the sincerity in his eyes left her unsure of how to proceed. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elon nodded, but the conversation felt unfinished, as if there was more he wanted to say but couldn't quite articulate. As the days passed, Samantha began to see the impact of Elon's gesture. Donations poured in, volunteers doubled, and plans for a new state-of-the-art facility were already underway. Yet, despite the progress, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between her and Elon was still unresolved. For his part, Elon found himself drawn to the shelter more often, not out of obligation, but because it had become a place where he felt grounded. Each visit brought him closer to understanding the woman he had underestimated and the life she had built. One evening, as they walked through the newly renovated kennels, Samantha turned to him suddenly. "Why didn't you take the deal with Arco Energy?" she asked. Elon paused, his hands in his pockets. "Because it would have meant breaking my word to you. And because I realized some things are more important than profits." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully believe in his transformation. "You're full of surprises, Elon Musk." He chuckled lightly. "I'm just getting started." As they continued their walk, the distance that had once defined their relationship began to fade. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew they were on the brink of something new, something real. The evening air was cool and crisp as Elon wandered the shelter grounds, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. The renovations were almost complete. Bright, spacious kennels, a new veterinary wing, and an education center for the community. Yet, amidst all the progress, Elon's thoughts were elsewhere. He held a small, leather-bound notebook in his hands. It wasn't his. A volunteer had handed it to him earlier, explaining that Samantha had left it in the office. The notebook's worn edges suggested it had been well used, and its contents intrigued him more than he cared to admit. He opened it tentatively, feeling a twinge of guilt. Inside were pages filled with Samantha's neat handwriting, notes about shelter operations, to-do lists, and at the back, more personal entries. He paused on one page, the words catching his eye. "Some days, I feel like I'm running on borrowed time. The doctors don't say it, but I can see it in their faces. They're preparing me for the worst. I'm not afraid of what happens to me, but I am afraid of leaving everything unfinished. The shelter, the animals, even this strange partnership with Elon. I don't think he sees me, not really. But then there are moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when I think maybe he does. And that scares me even more." Elon closed the notebook, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words settled over him. Samantha had always been a fortress of determination, her emotions carefully guarded. Reading her fears and doubts laid bare felt like peeling back a layer of armor he hadn't realized she wore. He found her in the main building, bent over a desk as she reviewed adoption applications. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting from surprise to suspicion when she saw the notebook in his hand. "You found that," she said flatly, her tone giving nothing away. "A volunteer gave it to me," he replied, setting it on the desk. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but you read it," she finished, her voice steady but cool. Elon hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Samantha sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I suppose you found my melodramatic ramblings entertaining." "They weren't melodramatic," Elon said, his voice quieter now. "They were honest." She folded her arms, her defenses rising. "So what? You're here to tell me I shouldn't feel that way? That everything's going to be fine?" "No," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'm here to tell you I see you." The words hung in the air, and Samantha's posture stiffened. "Don't say things like that unless you mean them, Elon." "I do," he insisted, stepping closer. "I've seen you fight for every animal in this shelter. I've seen you carry more than anyone should have to, all while dealing with something no one should face alone. And I've seen the way you care, not just for the animals, but for people, even when they don't deserve it." Her lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Elon continued, his tone softening. "When we started this, it was just a deal, a business decision. But you've changed that, Samantha. You've changed me." Samantha's eyes glistened, but she quickly looked away, shaking her head. "This isn't what we agreed to. This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," Elon said, "but it has. And I'm asking for a chance to make this real." Her breath hitched, and she turned to face him fully. "Why now? Why are you saying this now, after everything's?" "Because I was too blind to see it before," he admitted. "And because I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in his voice broke through her defenses, and for the first time, Samantha allowed herself to believe in the possibility of more. She exhaled shakily, her walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know if I can trust this," she whispered. "If I can trust you, then let me prove it," Elon said. "No contracts, no conditions, just us." Samantha searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but all she found was a man who, against all odds, had begun to truly care. After a long moment, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay." That night, they sat together in the quiet of the shelter, talking until the early hours. For the first time, there were no barriers, no pretense, just two people navigating a connection they never expected to find. And as the first light of dawn broke through the horizon, Elon realized that for all his wealth and accomplishments, this was the most important thing he'd ever built. Months passed, and the transformation in both Elon and Samantha's lives was undeniable. The shelter, now officially renamed the Samantha Greer Foundation for Animal Welfare and Sustainability, had become a beacon of hope and inspiration. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a sprawling sanctuary with facilities for animal rehabilitation, adoption, and education programs that reach communities across the country. Samantha stood in the foundation's new central courtyard, watching a group of children interact with rehabilitated dogs. Laughter filled the air as a Labrador retrieved a toy, wagging its tail furiously as it returned to a giggling girl. The sight brought a smile to Samantha's face, though her thoughts lingered on the journey that had brought her here. Elon approached from the side, his presence always unmistakable. He was dressed casually, jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but the confidence in his stride was as sharp as ever. Yet, as he stopped beside her, his expression softened in a way she had come to know well. "It's something, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the children. "It is," Samantha replied, her voice tinged with pride. "I never thought it would get this far." "It wouldn't have, without you," Elon said. Samantha looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "And without you," she admitted softly. He smiled faintly, his hand brushing against hers before he clasped it gently. For all his brilliance, Elon had struggled to navigate personal relationships for most of his life. But with Samantha, he'd found something he hadn't expected, something that didn't require equations or innovation to understand. "Are you ready?" he asked. Samantha blinked. "For what?" "You'll see." The event was held in a grand yet intimate venue in Los Angeles, a gala to celebrate the official launch of the Foundation's international initiative. The room buzzed with excitement as donors, activists, and celebrities mingled, each eager to be part of the story that had captured the public's imagination. When Samantha stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech, the crowd fell silent. Dressed in a midnight blue gown, her auburn curls framing her face, she exuded both elegance and authenticity. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "When this journey started, it was just me and a handful of volunteers doing everything we could to keep a small shelter running. I couldn't have imagined we'd be here today, standing on the cusp of something so much bigger than any of us." Her eyes briefly met Elon's in the audience, and her voice softened. "This foundation isn't just about animals. It's about compassion, resilience, and believing in a future where every life, no matter how small, matters. That's what my father taught me, and that's what I hope to pass on to others." The room erupted into applause, but the moment wasn't over. As Samantha stepped back, Elon joined her on stage, taking the microphone. The crowd murmured, sensing something unusual. "I don't usually make speeches at events like this," Elon began, his tone light, drawing a ripple of laughter. "But tonight is special." He turned to Samantha, his expression uncharacteristically tender. "This foundation exists because of you. Your vision, your heart, your relentless drive. They've inspired not just me, but everyone who's been lucky enough to witness it." Samantha's cheeks flushed, her eyes shimmering with emotion as she tried to process what was happening. "And so," Elon continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small box, "I want to make this official in a way that's no longer tied to contracts, conditions, or obligations, just love." The room gasped as Elon knelt, opening the box to reveal a simple yet stunning diamond ring. "Samantha Greer," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Will you marry me? For real this time?" Samantha's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. She nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Yes." Elon stood, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into an embrace. For a man who had spent his life chasing the stars, Elon Musk realized he'd found something even more extraordinary here on Earth. Their story became a symbol of unexpected connections and second chances. Together, Elon and Samantha built not just a foundation, but a life filled with purpose and love. In the years to come, they expanded the sanctuary to other countries, blending Elon's innovative vision with Samantha's unwavering compassion. And as they faced challenges together, one thing remained constant: their belief in the power of creating a better world, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed hope. In the end, Elon Musk learned that some things, trust, love, and purpose, couldn't be engineered. They had to be discovered, nurtured, and fought for. And for Samantha, the woman who'd started with nothing but a dream, life had given her more than she'd ever dared to hope for. Together, they proved that even the most improbable partnerships could lead to extraordinary results.